It was supposed to be a routine, ghost leave, for Delta Force operator Mark Dalton and his K-9 partner, Buster. That changed the second he spotted Sarah Jensen, stumbling in a torn purple dress, sprinting through the Chicago crowds with a professional hit team closing the gap. In one fluid motion, he pulled her into the freezing shadows of an alleyway just heartbeats before the gunmen swept past. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. Sarah had stumbled upon a treasonous secret held by a ruthless billionaire. And now, Mark and his dog are the only barrier standing between her and a permanent cleanup operation. Before we dive into this heart-pounding mission, let us know in the comments, which city are you watching from today? And if you believe that no one is above the law, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story of justice. The biting wind off Lake Michigan whipped through the towering canyons of downtown Chicago, carrying the scent of exhaust and incoming snow. It was a jagged, steel-colored afternoon in the Windy City, where the roar of the L train overhead drowned out the city's secrets. Mark Dalton, a 34-year-old Tier 1 operator, moved through the surging sidewalk traffic with the predatory stillness of a man who had survived the world's most dangerous zip codes. He was a man trained to spot a threat long before it became a tragedy, and as the mist began to settle over the skyscrapers, his tactical instincts told him that his vacation had just officially ended. The shadows of the alley felt like a cold embrace as Mark Dalton kept his hand firmly but gently over Sarah's mouth. Her breath was coming in ragged hitches, a sharp contrast to the disciplined, almost silent respiration of the man holding her. Below them, Buster was a statue of muscle and fur, his ears swiveling toward the mouth of the alley where the rhythmic crunch of boots on grit grew louder. Mark didn't look at Sarah. His focus was entirely on the sliver of the street visible between the brick walls. Two figures stepped into the frame, silhouetted against the gray Chicago afternoon. They wore the navy blue windbreakers of the local precinct, the word police emblazoned in high-visibility yellow across their backs. To any civilian, they represented safety, the end of a nightmare. But Mark's internal alarm, tuned by a decade of Tier 1 operations, was screaming a different story. He performed a rapid, tactical scan, deconstructing the men in seconds. It wasn't just the way they moved, with a predatory, sweeping motion that lacked the standard procedural caution of beat cops. It was the equipment. The man on the left was carrying a customized submachine gun tucked tightly against his vest, an expensive, high-end variant rarely seen in a standard police armory. More importantly, Mark spotted the ink, a small, jagged crest tattooed just above the lead officer's wrist. It was the sigil of the Aegis Group, the elite, private mercenary wing of Richard Hale's empire. "Clear," one of the men barked, his voice devoid of the usual radio chatter and public service cadence. He didn't check the shadows, he checked the sightlines. They weren't looking to protect a citizen, they were clearing a kill zone. Mark felt Sarah tremble beneath his touch as she realized the uniforms were a lie. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a vibration more than a sound. "Those aren't cops," he whispered. "They're Hale's cleanup crew. If you run to them, you're dead before you hit the sidewalk." He slowly retracted his hand, sensing her sudden, icy realization. She looked at him, her brown eyes wide with the terror of a woman who had just realized the entire world was rigged against her. Mark's expression remained a mask of iron focus. He knew exactly what Hale was doing, using the authority of the state as a skin suit for his own private vengeance. The predator's scent was thick in the air, a metallic tang of corruption and high-velocity lead. Buster let out a low, vibrational growl, a warning meant only for Mark's ears. A third man was approaching from the opposite end of the alley. They were being pinched. Mark shifted his weight, his hand sliding toward the concealed sidearm at his hip. The time for hiding was ending. The time for a Delta Force response was about to begin. The heavy iron door of the freight elevator groaned, a metallic protest that echoed through the concrete cavern of the basement level. Mark didn't reach for a light switch. Instead, he navigated the pitch-black space with a rhythmic confidence, his hand resting lightly on Buster's harness. Behind him, Sarah stumbled, the heels of her evening shoes clicking sharply against the oil-stained floor. "Stay close," Mark murmured, his voice cutting through the damp silence. He reached out, finding her arm in the dark and guiding her toward a secondary reinforced door. He punched a complex sequence into a keypad that glowed with a faint, crimson backlight. With a hiss of hydraulic seals, the door retracted, revealing the interior of a converted industrial garage. As the overhead industrial lamps flickered to life, the underground sanctuary revealed itself. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress of functionality. To the left, a matte black SUV sat prepped for a fast exit, its windows tinted to an impenetrable dark. To the right, a long workbench was organized with surgical precision, holding tactical gear, encrypted comms units, and a row of monitors displaying live feeds from the alleyway they had just escaped. Sarah stood near the entrance, her purple dress a jarring splash of color against the cold steel and concrete. She was shivering, not just from the Chicago chill, but from the adrenaline crash that was now setting in. Mark moved to a locker and pulled out a heavy wool tactical jacket, tossing it to her. "Put that on. Shock will kill you faster than Hale's men if you let it." He then turned to a small kitchenette area, pouring a glass of water and dropping in an electrolyte tablet. He handed it to her, his eyes searching hers for the first time since the rescue. Up close, he could see the smeared mascara and the way her fingers trembled as she took the glass. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice small and brittle. "You don't even know me. You're Delta Force, you're supposed to be in a desert somewhere, not saving waitresses in alleys." Mark leaned against the workbench, the light catching the sharp angles of his face. Buster sat at his feet, his head tilted as he watched Sarah with a protective stillness. "Hale thinks he owns this city because he has a $1 billion bank account," Mark said quietly. "But he doesn't own the streets, and he certainly doesn't own the people on them. I'm on leave, Sarah. That means I pick my own missions now. And right now, my mission is making sure you live long enough to tell the truth." For the first time, the terror in Sarah's eyes flickered and died, replaced by a spark of wary hope. She took a long drink of the water, the tremors in her hands beginning to subside. In the silence of the bunker, a bridge was built, not of words, but of shared defiance. She reached into the hidden slit of her dress and pulled out a small, blood-stained flash drive. "Then we better get to work," she whispered. "Because what's on this drive is the only reason I'm still breathing." The blue glow of the monitors cast long, sharp shadows across Mark's face as Sarah placed the blood-stained flash drive on the metal workbench. Her fingers lingered on the plastic casing for a moment, as if the device itself carried the weight of the lives already lost to protect it. Mark didn't rush her. He took the drive, sliding it into an air-gapped laptop, a machine completely isolated from any network to prevent Hale's tech savants from tracking their location. Lines of encrypted code began to cascade down the screen, a digital waterfall of treason. Sarah leaned in, her voice trembling but resolute as she began to decode the nightmare she had discovered. "It's called Project Chimera," she whispered, her eyes reflecting the scrolling text. "Richard Hale isn't just building the next generation of military drones. He's built a backdoor, a master kill switch integrated into the global guidance systems of every allied drone currently in the air." Mark's jaw tightened. As a Delta Force operator, he knew exactly what that meant. In a conflict, the flick of a switch could turn a multi-billion-dollar defense network into a graveyard of dead steel, or worse, turn those weapons against the very soldiers they were meant to protect. Sarah pointed to a subfolder containing signed transaction logs. "Hale isn't just holding the switch. He's auctioning it. He's been in contact with a decentralized terror network for months. The bidding starts at $4 billion. The billionaire's betrayal was more than just corporate greed. It was a high-tech execution of national security. Sarah explained how Hale had framed her for the initial data leak, turning her from a top analyst into a fugitive overnight. He had used his influence to burn her life to the ground, ensuring that if she ever spoke up, she would be dismissed as a disgruntled, mentally unstable employee. "He thinks he's playing a game of chess where he owns all the pieces," Sarah said, looking up at Mark. "He doesn't care about the soldiers on the ground. To him, they're just variables in a profit margin." Mark looked at the screen, then at Buster, who sat alertly by the reinforced door. The stakes had shifted from a simple rescue to a mission of global consequence. If that drive didn't reach the right hands, the very drones Mark had relied on in the Middle East would become the tools of his brother's destruction. He reached out, closing the laptop with a definitive snap. The time for analysis was over. Hale had the money, the influence, and the private army, but he had made one fatal mistake. He had left a survivor, and that survivor was now under the protection of a man who specialized in making traitors regret their existence. "We aren't just hiding anymore," Mark said, his voice cold and focused. "We're going to hit him where it hurts." The silence of the underground sanctuary was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, violent shift in the air pressure. Mark's head snapped toward the reinforced door, his hand already gripping the frame of his sidearm. Buster didn't bark. He let out a low, chest-deep vibration that signaled a threat was already inside the perimeter. "Get behind the SUV," Mark commanded, his voice a rasping blade of authority. Sarah didn't hesitate, scrambling for cover just as the first breaching charge detonated against the steel door. The world exploded in a kaleidoscope of white light and pulverized concrete. Before the smoke could even settle, 3 figures in matte black tactical gear swarmed through the gap, their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the haze like predatory eyes. They moved with the surgical precision of Tier 1 contractors, but they weren't expecting a Delta Force operator already in a low-light fighting stance. Mark squeezed the trigger twice, the suppressed thuds of his weapon barely audible over the ringing in the air. The lead mercenary crumpled, the momentum of his entry carrying him face first into the cold concrete. "Buster, flank!" Mark roared. The German shepherd became a blur of fur and fury, launching himself from the shadows. He didn't go for the limbs. He went for the throat of the second man, his weight and speed taking the mercenary down with bone-snapping force. The third intruder swung his rifle toward the dog, but Mark was already moving, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He parried the barrel of the rifle, his forearm striking the man's neck with the force of a sledgehammer, followed by a relentless series of close-quarters strikes that neutralized the threat in seconds. Outside the breach, the screech of tires and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of heavy boots told Mark that this was only the first wave. Richard Hale wasn't just sending a message, he was attempting a scorched earth breach at midnight. Mark grabbed Sarah by the arm, pulling her toward the back of the SUV. "We're leaving, now." He threw a thermite grenade onto the workbench, the white-hot flare instantly beginning to melt the laptop and the traces of the flash drive they had analyzed. He wouldn't leave a single scrap of data for Hale's scavengers. As the SUV's engine roared to life, Mark rammed the vehicle into reverse, smashing through the secondary exit gate just as a second team of mercenaries flooded into the smoke-filled room. Sarah gripped the dashboard, her eyes fixed on the man beside her, a man who had just turned a death trap into a battlefield and walked out alive. The mission had changed. They were no longer just holding evidence, they were a moving target in a war that had just gone hot. The tires of the SUV screamed as Mark banked the vehicle into a subterranean parking garage beneath the Chicago financial district. The breach at midnight had left them exposed, and the primary drive was ash, but Mark knew that a ghost leave required redundancies. He had anticipated Hale's reach long ago. As the engine died, the silence of the garage felt heavy, pressurized by the proximity of the enemy. "Stay in the vehicle. Keep the engine running," Mark ordered, his voice echoing with a cold, metallic finality. He didn't look back to see Sarah's nod. He was already focused on the heavy titanium door of the private vaulting facility. This was the encryption heist, though in reality, it was a reclamation of the only insurance policy Mark had ever bothered to keep. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his boots making no sound on the polished concrete. Buster paced beside him, his hackles raised, his nose sampling the recycled air for the scent of ozone or gun oil. At the security checkpoint, Mark didn't present an ID. He pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner that wasn't linked to any state database. It was a private, off-grid circuit he'd paid for in cash and favor years prior. Inside the vault room, the air was chilled to protect the servers. Mark navigated the rows of safety deposit boxes until he reached number 734. He didn't use a key. He used a specialized electronic override tool, his fingers dancing across the device with the muscle memory of a man who had breached insurgent strongholds in the dead of night. With a heavy *clack*, the drawer slid open. Inside lay a secondary physical encryption key, a ruggedized, military-grade hardware token containing the master logs of Project Chimera. Just as his fingers closed around the cold metal, the overhead lights flickered and died, replaced by the rhythmic, pulsing crimson of the emergency strobes. A synthesized voice announced a lockdown. Hale's reach had extended into the banking grid faster than Mark had predicted. He could hear the heavy thud of boots on the stairs above. The cleanup crew had arrived, and they weren't interested in making arrests. Mark slid the key into his tactical vest and whistled a low, sharp note. Buster lunged toward the exit, his body low to the ground. Mark followed, his sidearm drawn, his thumb flicking the safety to fire. He had the evidence, but the bank was now a kill box. He had entered as a ghost, but he would have to leave as a storm. Every shadow in the corridor was now a potential muzzle flash, and the only way out was through the men Hale had sent to bury him. The SUV's tires roared against the pavement as Mark swerved into a narrow service lane, the crimson emergency lights of the bank fatting behind them. "The car is tagged," Mark said, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror where a pair of blacked-out sedans were weaving through traffic with reckless, professional aggression. He didn't wait for Sarah's reaction. He slammed the brakes near the entrance of a subway station, the screeching metal of violent punctuation to his decision. "Out! Now! Buster heel!" They plunged into the mouth of the station, descending into the subterranean heat and the smell of ozone and old grease. The L-train pursuit was no longer a chase. It was a hunt through a labyrinth. Mark moved with a calculated urgency, weaving Sarah through the surging crowd of commuters. To the people of Chicago, they were just another couple in a hurry, but to the men descending the stairs behind them, they were targets on a thermal sweep. On the platform, the air began to hum, the distant rumble of an approaching train vibrating through the soles of Mark's boots. He glanced back, spotting the lead mercenary, a man in a civilian leather jacket that didn't quite hide the bulk of a concealed holster. The contractor caught Mark's eye and reached for his comms. Mark didn't give him the chance to coordinate. As the silver doors of the train hissed open, Mark didn't board the car directly in front of him. He grabbed Sarah's hand and sprinted toward the far end of the platform, leaping into the last carriage just as the chimes signaled the doors to close. The train jolted forward, pulling out of the station. Through the scratched glass of the rear door, Mark watched the mercenary stand stranded on the platform, a figure of frozen fury. But Mark knew better than to relax. Hale owned the infrastructure. "He'll have teams at the next 3 stops," Mark whispered, guiding Sarah to a seat in the center of the car where they were shielded from the windows. He opened his tactical vest, checking the secondary encryption key. It was still there, a cold weight against his chest. Sarah looked at him, her face pale under the flickering fluorescent lights of the carriage. "How do they find us so fast?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark scanned the car, his eyes landing on the security camera in the corner. "They aren't just following us, Sarah. They're watching us through the city's own eyes." He realized then that as long as they were in the grid, Hale was God. To win, they had to stop running and start cutting the wires. He leaned in close to her, the roar of the tunnel filling the silence between them. "At the next stop, we aren't getting off. We're going to the roof." The rhythmic clattering of the L-train faded into a distant hum as they found refuge in the skeletal remains of an abandoned clock tower overlooking the Chicago skyline. The air here was thin and tasted of iron and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the sterilized, high-tech corridors of Richard Hale's world. Mark sat on a crate, his movements methodical as he stripped, cleaned, and reassembled his sidearm. Buster lay at his feet, ears twitching at every gust of wind that whistled through the cracked masonry. It was the quiet before the storm, that heavy, pressurized silence that precedes a Tier 1 breach. Sarah sat opposite him, wrapped in the oversized tactical jacket Mark had given her. The purple silk of her dress was now stained and frayed, a metaphor for the life she had left behind in that alley. She watched his hands, scarred, steady, and terrifyingly efficient. "You do this every day, don't you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper in the vast, hollow space. "Live in the spaces between the shadows." Mark paused, the slide of his weapon clicking into place with a definitive snap. He looked up, his sharp, scanning brown eyes softening just enough to let her in. "I live where I'm needed, Sarah. In my world, silence isn't just a tactic, it's survival. But for you, the silence was a cage Hale put you in. Tonight, we break it." He reached into his kit and pulled out a small, encrypted earpiece, leaning forward to brush a stray strand of hair behind her ear as he fitted the device. The touch was professional yet unexpectedly tender. For a fleeting second, the ghost operator and the framed analyst weren't just assets in a conspiracy. They were two people bound by a shared trauma and a singular purpose. Sarah's breath hitched, not from fear this time, but from the sudden, grounding weight of his presence. "I was so alone," she admitted, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "I thought no one would ever see the truth." Mark placed a steady hand on her shoulder, his thumb grazing the collar of the jacket. "I saw you," he said, his voice a low, resonant anchor. "And Buster saw you. In the Delta, we have a saying, no one gets left behind. You're part of the unit now, Sarah. You aren't just a witness anymore. You're the mission." The emotional bridge was complete. Sarah straightened her shoulders, the tremor in her hands finally stilled by the iron certainty in his gaze. She looked out at the shimmering lights of Hale's Century Tower in the distance, a monument to ego and treason. The fear that had defined her for days was gone, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. They were no longer running. The storm was coming, and this time they were the ones bringing the thunder. The transition from the shadow-drenched clock tower to the blinding opulence of Sterling Plaza was a jarring descent into a different kind of battlefield. The Lion's Den was a cathedral of glass and steel, swarming with Chicago's elite and protected by a security apparatus that was more paramilitary than private. Mark Dalton stepped out of the shadows of a side street, his presence transformed. The rugged tactical gear had been replaced by a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, the sharp tailoring concealing the lethal tools of his trade. Beside him, Sarah was a vision of reclaimed power, her new gown a shimmering armor of emerald silk that hid the encrypted hardware tokens strapped to her thigh. Buster was nowhere to be seen, having already transitioned into ghost mode to navigate the service vents, but Mark could feel the rhythmic pulse of the dog's tracker through his smartwatch. "Keep your chin up," Mark whispered, his voice a smooth, low anchor as they approached the primary security checkpoint. "You aren't a fugitive tonight, Sarah. You're a guest of honor who just hasn't been invited yet." The lobby was a gauntlet of biometric scanners and high-definition facial recognition. As they stepped into the scanning field, Mark felt the familiar cold tightening in his chest, the combat itch. He had used a specialized scramble code on Sarah's ID profile, but Hale's AI was aggressive. Just as the scanner turned a cautionary amber, Mark leaned in, playing the role of the bored, wealthy socialite, his hand resting possessively on Sarah's waist to shield her from the primary camera's angle. With a soft chime, the light flickered to green. They were in. The ballroom was a sea of champagne and treachery. Richard Hale stood at the far end on a raised dais, holding court beneath a massive holographic projection of a drone, the very weapon he intended to castrate for profit. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the underlying ozone of 1,000 electronic devices. Every waiter with an earpiece was a target. Every hidden camera was a threat. Mark led Sarah onto the dance floor, moving with a practiced, fluid grace that masked his constant tactical scanning. As they spun through the crowd, his eyes met Hale for a fleeting second. The billionaire didn't recognize them, not yet, but the predator's instinct in Mark's gut was howling. They were deep behind enemy lines, surrounded by a private army in a fortress of high-tech vanity. The Century of Innovation Gala was about to become the site of a very public execution, not of a person, but of a legacy. Sarah's hand tightened on Mark's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the server room access door. The infiltration was complete. Now the real war began. The gala's air-conditioned chill couldn't mask the mounting tension as Mark Dalton navigated Sarah toward the server room's side entrance. While Richard Hale began his speech on the main stage, boasting about a safer world through his Chimera drone initiative, Mark slipped into the shadows of the utility corridor. He moved with a terrifying, silent fluidity, his tuxedo jacket flaring as he drew his suppressed sidearm. This was the final broadcast, the moment the billionaire's digital empire would be used to dismantle his physical one. Mark signaled Sarah toward the terminal, but the door hissed open to reveal Hale's lead mercenary and 3 tactical operators waiting in the dark. They hadn't been fooled by the tuxedos. Before the lead guard could even raise his weapon, Mark transitioned into a blur of high-speed violence. He didn't just shoot, he dismantled. A calculated burst neutralized the first two, while he used the third as a human shield, his movements a masterclass in Delta Force close-quarters combat. From the ventilation shaft above, Buster launched himself into the fray, a canine missile that pinned the lead mercenary to the floor before he could trigger the alarm. "Go, do it now," Mark commanded, his eyes fixed on the hallway monitors as more signatures began to converge on their position. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, her face bathed in the cold blue light of the mainframe. She bypassed the firewalls with the desperation of a woman reclaiming her life. "I'm in," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and triumph. "I'm overriding the main Gala feed. The encryption key is live." On the ballroom's massive holographic screens, Hale's polished presentation suddenly flickered and died. It was replaced not by marketing data, but by the jagged, undeniable truth. The audio of Hale's secret negotiations played over the speakers, his voice cold and arrogant as he discussed the kill switch price tags. The room fell into a deafening, horrified silence. The elite guests watched in real time as the billionaire on the stage was unmasked as a traitor. Mark stood at the server room door, his weapon leveled at the approaching security detail. He wasn't just a soldier anymore, he was a guardian of the truth. He watched through the monitor as Hale's face turned from confusion to a mask of ashen terror. The final broadcast was a digital execution. As the sirens of the federal task force began to wail in the streets below, Mark looked back at Sarah. She was no longer shaking. She stood tall in the emerald light, the woman who had brought a giant to his knees. The mission was complete. The silence had finally been broken. The roar of the ballroom had been replaced by the rhythmic, blue and red pulsing of emergency lights reflecting off the glass facade of Sterling Tower. Down on the street, the air was thick with the wail of sirens and the heavy presence of federal agents. Richard Hale, the man who had once moved the world with a whisper, was now being led out in steel restraints, his expensive silk suit crumpled and his face a mask of shattered arrogance. He looked around wildly, searching for the man who had dismantled his empire in a single night, but the sidewalk was a sea of strangers and flashing lights. The billionaire was being pulled into a reality where his wealth was no longer a shield, but a target. High above the chaos, on a darkened balcony overlooking the Chicago River, Mark Dalton stood in the shadows, his midnight blue tuxedo jacket draped over one arm. The combat itch had finally settled into a cold, quiet satisfaction. Beside him, Sarah stood watching the flashing lights below, her emerald dress fluttering in the freezing lake breeze. She looked at her hands, they were steady now. The transition from prey to witness was complete. "They'll be looking for a statement," Sarah said softly, her eyes finding marks in the dark. "They'll want to know who helped me. They'll want to know who you are." Mark looked out at the city, the into the fog instinct already taking hold. He wasn't a man meant for press conferences or medals. He was a ghost, a Tier 1 operator who lived in the spaces between the headlines. "They have the drive, and they have the man," Mark replied, his voice a low, resonant anchor. "That's all they need. The rest is just noise." He reached out, squeezing her hand one last time, a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had shared. Then, with a short, sharp whistle, he signaled to Buster. The German shepherd emerged from the shadows of the service door, his tail giving a single, disciplined wag of farewell to Sarah. "Make it count, Sarah," Mark murmured. "The truth is yours now, keep it loud." Before she could find the words to thank him, Mark turned and stepped into the service stairwell, disappearing into the dark heart of the building. By the time the first federal investigators reached the balcony, there was nothing left but the cold Chicago wind. Down at the river's edge, a nondescript black SUV pulled away from the curb, its headlights off as it merged into the swirling midnight mist. Mark Dalton was gone, slipping back into the silent life of a shadow warrior, leaving behind a city that was safer, a woman who was stronger, and a traitor who would finally learn the price of a soldier's leave. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil, they're fought in the shadows to protect the innocent. Mark had every reason to walk away. He was on leave, far from the battlefield. But when he saw Sarah running for her life, something in him couldn't ignore the call. That split-second decision to pull her into that alley changed everything. True heroism isn't about the uniform you wear. It's about standing up when no one else will. If this story moved you, type protected below and share it with someone who needs to remember that good people still fight for what's right. Subscribe for more stories of courage. God bless you.